At its peak, RadioShack had more than 7,000 stores in the United States, a store within 10 miles of 94% of the American population. And in the back of every one of those stores, in a display that ran from floor to ceiling, was something no other national chain had ever attempted at walk-in retail scale: components. Individual resistors in bags of 20, capacitors in 5 values, potentiometers, toggle switches, binding posts, alligator clips, breadboards, wire by the foot. Things priced at 49 cents, at $1.29, at $2.99. Things that, in the right hands, could be assembled into a radio, a timer, an amplifier, a burglar alarm, a telegraph. Things that, in the hands of a 10-year-old with the right catalog, could be assembled into the beginning of a career. In February 2015, RadioShack filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in the U.S. Bankruptcy Court for the District of Delaware after 11 consecutive quarterly losses. More than 4,000 stores closed. The component walls came down. The version of this story you've probably heard frames what followed as retail collapse, bad management, changing markets, Amazon. That version isn't wrong, it's just not the story. RadioShack didn't die because the market changed. It died because its own management looked at an irreplaceable institutional identity and chose to replace it with something anyone could buy from 3 other stores. In doing so, they destroyed the only physical place in America where a curious child with $3 could learn to build things. The name itself tells you what the company was always supposed to be. Theodore and Milton Deutschman opened the first RadioShack at 46 Brattle Street in downtown Boston in 1921. They chose that name deliberately. A RadioShack was maritime slang for the small wooden structure built topside on ships to house the radio transmitter and receiver. Cramped, functional, the technical heart of long-distance communication at sea. The Deutschmans thought it appropriate for a store that would supply radio officers aboard ships, as well as the growing community of amateur ham radio operators on land. Their first devoted customers were maritime radio officers. Their original product line was ship radio parts and ham radio components. The name wasn't metaphor, it was description. The store was called a Radio Shack because it served the people who worked in Radio Shacks. By 1939, the company had published its first mail-order catalog. By the early 1960s, it had 9 retail stores plus an extensive mail-order business, and it was nearly bankrupt. The identity was intact. The finances weren't. On April 1, 1963, Charles Tandy booked a junior ballroom at the Ritz-Carlton in Boston and called a meeting of RadioShack employees. What he told them was that he had just bought the company for $300,000. Price Waterhouse had audited the chain's book value to zero. It carried $4.5 million in debt. He bought it anyway. Tandy was a Fort Worth leather goods retailer, not an engineer. His insight into RadioShack wasn't technical, it was commercial. He understood that a customer who needed a specific capacitor and had no mail-order trade account had exactly one option: the RadioShack 2 miles from his house. That's not a niche, that's a moat. He immediately cut inventory from roughly 40,000 items to 2,500 bestsellers. He hired staff from the hobbyist community, people who knew what they were selling because they used what they were selling. He opened in strip malls and shopping centers in mid-sized American cities, not major metropolitan flagship locations, but the towns where the electronics hobbyist had nowhere else to go. Within 2 years of the acquisition, the company was profitable. Tandy stated his strategy plainly in his own writing. "We intend to duplicate what we achieved with Tandy Leather, that is, to manufacture practically everything that we sell." The Archer and Realistic house brands appeared on speakers, cables, antennas, everything in the store. By 1973, RadioShack had more than 2,800 locations. The 1984 catalog listed 8,800 locations across 80 countries. Walk into a RadioShack in 1975 and find the back of the store. Floor to ceiling, rows of small plastic packages hanging from metal hooks. Resistors in tan packages, capacitors in multiple values and types, diodes, transistors, toggle switches, LEDs in red and green and yellow, Potentiometers, relays, fuses, breadboards, wire in every gauge, alligator clips, soldering iron tips, heat shrink tubing. Everything needed to build something from nothing. For 49 cents, $1.29, $2.99 a package. No other national chain sold like this. Industrial distributors, Mauser, Allied Electronics, Newark, served professionals with trade accounts and minimum orders. They weren't set up for a walk-in cash sale to a kid who didn't know what he needed. RadioShack sold to anyone, in any quantity, for cash. That was the specific thing it did that no national competitor replicated at any comparable scale. The staff enforced the identity. RadioShack employees in this era were typically drawn from the same hobbyist community they served: ham radio operators, kit builders, retired engineers, people who had been building amplifiers in their garage since the Kennedy administration. They knew which capacitor you needed for a 9-volt circuit. They could explain it without making you feel stupid for asking. That knowledge wasn't incidental. It was the mechanism. The component wall was only useful to a non-expert because a knowledgeable person stood behind the counter. The science fair electronics kits formalized that pipeline into a product. The kit was a wooden box containing a board populated with spring-mounted terminals arranged in a numbered grid. Each component was permanently fixed to the board. To build a circuit, you pushed the tinned end of a colored wire into a spring terminal until it snapped shut, connected it to the next terminal the manual specified, and repeated. No soldering, no tools beyond the kit itself. The design could be built and rebuilt indefinitely without damaging a single component. Science fair kits appeared in RadioShack catalogs during the late 1960s. The line grew through configurations: 50-in-1, 75-in-1, 100-in-1, 150-in-1, eventually 200-in-1. Each kit came with a manual describing every circuit the board could build: transistor amplifiers, AM radio receivers, light-operated switches, moisture detectors, electronic timers, code practice oscillators, burglar alarm circuits, telephone amplifiers. Forrest Mims III was an amateur scientist who had been filling personal notebooks with hand-drawn circuit diagrams. In the mid-1970s, a RadioShack employee noticed those notebooks. What followed was the Engineer's Notebook series, project guides written for the same curious, self-teaching builder the component wall was already serving. Those books eventually sold millions of copies. The relationship ran in both directions. The books directed readers to the component wall. The component wall gave the books something concrete to purchase. A reader later recalled biking to his local RadioShack at 13, working through the notebook examples, and then starting to deviate, changing a component value, watching what happened, asking why. That deviation is where the career begins. That trajectory, kit to career, isn't unique to any one builder. A Facebook community centered on the science fair 150-in-1 includes members who describe the kit as the reason they pursued electronics professionally. One wrote that it helped earn a degree in electronics. Another received a kit from a family that weren't that well off and gathered the components over years. The point of access cost less than $10. The career didn't. Engineering career books from this period included Window Shop at RadioShack and Burned Down the School Gym with Your Science Fair Project as recognized signs of a future engineer. That's not satire. That's a documented cultural pipeline from retail breadboard kit to professional practice, being named in professional literature. Heathkit served the same era with its own assembly products, complete working devices you built from scratch, discontinued in 1992. The two brands are mourned together in the same breath by people who remember them, and they represent adjacent but distinct things. Heathkit required knowing you wanted to build something. RadioShack's science fair kits worked on children who didn't know what they wanted yet. In August 1977, RadioShack introduced the TRS-80 Model 1 at $599, approximately $3,100 in today's dollars. The system included a full-stroke QWERTY keyboard, a 12-inch video monitor, a cassette recorder, a power supply, and a Zilog Z80 processor running Level 1 Basic. 4 kilobytes of RAM, no color display, storage via audio cassette. Tandy's engineers had planned an initial run of 3,500 units. They sold more than 10,000 in the first month and a half. The Smithsonian Institution's description of the TRS-80, now in its American Enterprise collection, is precise. The availability of the TRS-80 on 5,000 RadioShack store shelves helped the Model 1 sell over 100,000 units during its first year, an estimated 10% of all personal computers in use at that point. The TRS-80 was one of 3 computers constituting what Byte magazine called the 1977 Trinity: the Apple II, the Commodore PET, and the TRS-80, all released within months of each other. An MIT competitive analysis thesis places early unit shipments at approximately 100,000 TRS-80s against roughly 25,000 Commodore PETs and 20,000 Apple IIs in the comparable period. Apple at this point was selling through hobbyist channels, specialty shops, and mail order. RadioShack was selling through thousands of stores and strip malls across the American middle class. By 1982, the Commodore 64 had entered the market at a lower price point and begun displacing the TRS-80 at home. By 1984, Tandy stopped upgrading the TRS-80 line entirely. By 1982 or 1983, Apple had overtaken it in cumulative units. The window was 5 years. But in those 5 years, RadioShack's founding identity, the store for people who want to understand how things work, had reached its largest possible expression: the personal computer for middle-class America. The component wall in the back, the science fair kit on the shelf, and the TRS-80 in the display case. Charles Tandy died on November 4, 1978, at age 60. Heart attack, in his sleep, in Fort Worth. The company he left had 20,000 employees, approximately 7,000 RadioShack outlets, and annual revenues of approximately $10 billion. The management that inherited it had the stores. They didn't always have the clarity about why the stores worked. The drift wasn't sudden. Each step had its own logic. In 1982, the breakup of the Bell system let consumers own their own telephones for the first time instead of renting them from phone companies. RadioShack offered 20 phone models that year. Reasonable product. The technical staff could explain them. No obvious conflict yet. In 1991, Tandy closed or restructured its 200 RadioShack computer centers and, in the company's own words, attempted to shift its emphasis away from components and cables toward mainstream consumer electronics. That phrase appears in the corporate record, not an inference, a stated intention. In 1993, Tandy sold its personal computer manufacturing to AST Research. The house brand computers were gone. The vertical integration Tandy had called his competitive advantage was sold off. In 1994, the company abandoned its America's Technology Store slogan for "You've got questions, we've got answers." The slogan had described the staff. When the component wall staff were replaced by commission employees whose primary incentive was phone plan activations, the answers stopped being available. By the mid-1990s, the component bins had thinned. Flip phone displays occupied the space where resistor racks had been. In 2000, Tandy Corporation formally renamed itself RadioShack Corporation. By 2003, nearly half of all sales came from wireless phones and accessories. RadioShack was now competing directly with Best Buy and Walmart for consumer electronics sales it would never win on price or selection, while simultaneously losing its component customers to Mouser, DigiKey, and Amazon. 2 markets. Neither of them won. And the one market where it had faced no competition at all was gone. Wikipedia's article on RadioShack describes this period with precision. The company, long accustomed to charging wide margins on specialized products not readily available from other local retailers, was placed into direct competition against vendors such as Best Buy and Walmart. That is the mechanism. RadioShack abandoned the territory where it was undefeatable and entered the territory where it couldn't win. In February 2015, after 11 consecutive quarterly losses, RadioShack filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Standard General, a hedge fund, acquired the remaining assets through its subsidiary General Wireless for $26.2 million. A company that had generated $4.8 billion in annual revenues at its peak sold for less than many Manhattan apartments. Sprint opened stores within 1,435 of the surviving locations. General Wireless filed a second bankruptcy in March 2017. The brand passed through two more owners and arrived in 2023 with the El Salvador-based Unicomer Group. Fewer than 500 franchise locations remain today. Some of them still carry components. Those locations, the ones that kept the founding identity, that still stock resistors and capacitors for a customer with a project question, are among the most financially stable RadioShack operations left. The component wall customer never disappeared. RadioShack disappeared from them. YouTube tutorials are more comprehensive than anything RadioShack ever published. Arduino boards are more capable than the TRS-80 at a fraction of the price. Mouser and DigiKey carry millions of parts with no current minimum order. The hobbyist who knows what they need can get it delivered overnight. What disappeared was something specific. Not the parts, the place. The place where you didn't need to know what you needed, because someone behind the counter could work it out with you. The place accessible without a trade account, without an internet connection, without already knowing what your project required. The place within 10 miles of 94% of the country, where 49 cents bought the beginning of an education. Multiply it by the millions of science fair kits sold across 2 decades, by the 100,000 TRS-80s in a single year, by the 7,000 stores where the question, "Which capacitor do I need?" had a human answer, and you get the scale of what was built and what was taken apart, decision by decision, across 30 years. RadioShack didn't fail because people stopped caring about electronics. It failed because it stopped being the place where they learned them. Those aren't the same failure, and only one of them was inevitable. The curious child with $3 and a question still exists. That child is out there right now. There's just nowhere to take the $3. Subscribe for more stories like this.